welcome those that have already joined, and I'll maybe do another shout out when we've got more people on as well. But yeah, to introduce myself, I'm Colin Hemmings. I'm a product manager here at Bitrise, involved with some monitoring products. We decided to host this webinar to explore some of the unique challenges and interesting aspects of monitoring mobile applications, and how we kind of take those things to the next level. We'll do some introductions with the rest of the panelists we got here, Marina, Antoine, and Bruno. So Marina, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, I can start. So hi, my name is Marina. I'm a software developer living in Copenhagen. I've been working with iOS development for 10 years. My last 9-to-5 job was leading iOS development at an audiobook company called Storytel for a few years. Now I'm working for myself, consulting and helping businesses build awesome products and apps. And I'm also mentoring a few developers in my free time.
Nice.
Yeah, that's it.
That's awesome. Antoine?
Yeah, Antoine van der Lee, living in the Netherlands in a small village called Spampens, but I guess it's a bit up north of Amsterdam. If you joined early, you know how my house looks and what's walking around. In my day-to-day job, I'm a iOS developer, lead iOS developer at WeTransfer, and I like blogging a lot. So you might know me as well from Swiftly and Swiftly Weekly, my weekly newsletter.
And Bruno?
Yeah, so my name is Bruno. I'm an iOS engineer at Spotify, and I also like to write stuff about Swift in my blog called Swift Rocks. Today, I work at Spotify mostly with infrastructure in the iOS part, but in the past in other companies, I play a lot with build monitoring and such, and build some tools around it. So it's a topic that interests me as well.
Awesome. So yeah, we've got this great panel here. Hopefully we'll cover some interesting topics, but also I'd like to encourage people to make use of the Q&A. There's a Q&A section as part of Zoom. Hopefully you can kind of find that as part of the navigation there. If you kind of raise questions as we go, we'll try to intersperse them as part of the conversation as best as possible. If we can't do that, we'll try and get some more at the end. But yeah, I very much encourage you to ask questions as they come through. Bring some tough ones to the panels if we can catch them off guard and really kind of test the bounds of their knowledge. And then, yeah, we'll kind of go from there. So just some formalities, all of the kind of views and opinions expressed by the panel here are purely their own views and opinions, and not in any way associated with the different companies and organizations that they work for. So just wanted to make that clear. Awesome. So let's kick things off and get into some monitoring talk. So monitoring is a fairly broad topic or domain, and how and I guess to the panel, and we'll start from there. How do you approach kind of monitoring, and what goals do you tend to have for the monitoring that you set up? And for that, Antoine, do you have any insights around that?
Yeah, definitely. To me at first, it's an ongoing thing, so we're kind of monitoring our monitoring as well in a way. We're constantly checking in with our support team to see like, hey, what are the issues being raised? And if at any time an issue pops up that we didn't see in our monitoring, but we find important enough, we would adjust our monitoring accordingly to make sure that next time we will catch those things. But more and more concrete, I think if we look at the goals we set with the team at WeTransfer, we try to monitor obviously crash-free percentage. We target like 99.5% crash-free users, and whenever we get under that number, it's kind of our priority to focus on that part. Besides other things like launch time, you don't want your app to launch really slowly, but also like the main flows of your application, whereas in our case it's receiving transfers. If that were to break, then yeah, we could basically throw away our whole application. So we're really focused on those main flows in a way.
How did you come up with those particular flows and goals for the monitoring? Is that just through experience? Is it kind of domain and like organization specific?
Yeah, I guess it's also a bit a generic way of monitoring. When you talk about apps, I guess every company kind of looks at crash reporting tools. The launch time might not be important for everyone. It depends as well on how big is your app. If your app is relatively small in terms of libraries and stuff, then it won't really become a problem likely. But yeah, WeTransfer's app is quite getting big, so it's becoming more and more a problem. But in terms of the main flows and stuff, we kind of created our own tooling around the issues that are mostly reported, and that builds up over time, So we have a diagnostics tool implemented, which at first was might pretty simple, It only contained just a few logs. But then it turned out that whenever a user reached out, we couldn't really get from the logs what their issue was. So we tried to figure out the bug. And while we do, we adjust the logging so that the next time it would be more clear to us what this issue for the user was. And when you do that over time, you kind of like level up your monitoring every now and then.
Okay. And so you're like on that kind of perpetual feedback loop of updating as you go. I guess you need to keep on top of purging out any old kind of metrics or monitors that you kind of had before then.
Yeah, exactly. You try to keep that up to date.
Awesome. Bruno, do you have any kind of opinions on the same topic?
Yeah, I had something that I would like to add in the topic of monitoring itself, because I think this is also something that mutates depending on the size of the company. I think that while a smaller company might see monitoring from the point of view of just crash reports, for example, the larger the company gets, I think the more granular this gets. For example, the startup time, like Antoine mentioned. Or if you get really big, you might start wondering about things like how much time am I spending locking down the main thread, thus blocking any UI updates. So the size of the company plays a big role in this. And it's good to adapt to what you're trying to do, to the size of what you actually need to inspect, I think.
And Marina, on the same topic, do you have insights there? And then kind of, if you can kind of take it a bit further, and when you do the monitoring, and then obviously the idea is to catch potential issues that you have in the application, how do you then leverage that data to work out how you prioritize those particular issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's really important, on top of having KPIs for your technical side of things, like number of issues or percentage of crash-free users. It's also important to understand how that impacts your business and prioritize things based on that. So it could be that a small crash in a sign-up flow is you consider that much higher priority than maybe a more often crash, but in a less important part of the app, like for example, when changing an app icon, like something that's more decorative. And you also might want to take into account which users are affected, like if it's new users that are mostly affected, or if it's more loyal users that are already paying and have been customers for longer, then that can help you prioritize things as well. So I think it's important to like work closely with your stakeholders. That's a very corporate-y and enterprisey word, but basically not only developers and customer support, but also product managers and the business side of things to decide where the priorities lie, because obviously we can't do everything that we want to do always. So we have to pick and choose what's best for the business as well.
So that's an interesting insight that you give there. Obviously aligning these technical requirements with the product and the business requirements. How do you reason about those trade-offs and which ones to go to, or is there anything to really reason about? Are you all kind of singing from the same hymn sheet really and trying to solve the same problems? How do you kind of combine the two objectives around the prioritization?
Yeah, like in my opinion, that's like one of the most tricky things in product development and software development is what do you prioritize? Because yeah, like as developers, we always want to do things in the best way, right? And not have any bugs, right? And then at the same time, of course, the product and business side also would like not to have any issues and make all the customers happy, and earn all the money in the world. But realistically, we all have limited resources, both in time and finances, right, from the company side. So there's always a trade-off somewhere, and it's so specific, I think, to each case that you just sit down and figure out what's like just in every specific case, in every specific team. I mean, of course, some things are super high priority. Like if you have a 90% crash rate, you probably want to put that on the top of the list, right, to fix. But when it comes down to more tricky things, it can be, like, I think it's on a case-by-case basis, and I don't have a clear answer to like, this is how you prioritize things, because that heavily depends on your users and your business and what are the issues that you're having that you want to fix. So yeah.
Yeah, I can add to that a funny transition I made is I went from a digital agency with like national applications with maybe like 1 million users a month to we transferred with multiple millions of users. And what you have when your app is such a higher scale, suddenly 1% becomes like 10,000 users, for example, or like something that looks really small. And in a way, Marina mentioned that as well. Something that looks really small suddenly is super big. And especially if that's combined with such an important screen like the purchase flow, I guess that makes it really easy to convince your managers like, hey, we need to work on this, because otherwise, like it's kind of an ABC in that way.
How do you deal with that as when you are operating at that scale? Like, you've got lots of these issues coming through and like slight variations potentially of the same issue. How do you, obviously you have the prioritization to know of the top ones which to work on next, but how do you filter out when there's like thousands of potential issues coming through?
Well, I guess if you have many of those, then something fundamental is wrong, obviously. I guess it really depends. If it were to be a lot, then it means you need to do a lot of bug fixing. But I guess then there is a root problem of the real thing. What we like to do is we have Bug Fix Friday. It's kind of an excuse to block a Friday every month, and that month we really pick up like the bugs we need to fix, or maybe less high priority bugs, but still like quick wins we can kind of get onto. And if you create that focused day with your team, you're getting in a certain flow, and it makes it easier to improve on that metric.
I would like to add something to that I thought it was interesting. When Colin was talking about what happens when you have multiple issues and they could cause multiple problems, I think this is an example where having decent tooling can actually help you out. Because, for example, Firebase is an example of a tool where if you have multiple crashes that are kind of the same crash, but they have different stacks, then Firebase can actually group those things together and say, hey, this is one issue. Rest aside, sometimes it does it wrong, and it groups things and it says the same thing, but it's actually not. And that's terrible when it happens. And most times it's actually gets it right, and that can be very helpful. And I think if you tie that with a decent login system inside your app, or even if you use Firebase logging itself in the breadcrumbs where you can see the details of the crash inside the crash itself, then you can actually use the tooling itself to kind of resolve the issue. You have everything there. There are multiple issues, but you have the logging from everyone in the same place. And you can kind of draw what's the connection between them. And then you know what you have to fix, basically.
That's a good point. That actually brings us through to a question that we've had in our chat from Roland. We've actually got two questions which are kind of somewhat related. Which tools do you use for measuring app startup times? So which tools are you using for this monitoring, and how do you differentiate between cold, warm, and hot starts? Do you want to carry on with that, Bruno?
Yeah, I talked about that, so we can say something. So in terms of tooling for measuring differences in time, I can say that at least at Spotify we have our own thing. But this is not very difficult in general, because in iOS you can get the raw timestamp of the CPU, so you can calculate time your own. That you don't need a super library for this. But in terms of cold and hot startup, yes, because the thing is that this is going to be true for most apps. but the state of something inside your app, most likely user, is definitely going to affect what kinds of things are loading when it launches. So it's very good to differentiate on that. So if you're launching because you just installed the app, or if you're launching because you want to make an account, or you already have this account and you're just relaunching the app, or you just backgrounded and open the app again. All of those things make a difference.
Definitely. But you guys are using internal stuff for that. So those kind of performance monitoring. Okay.
Yeah, but it's not something super complicated when you come to tracking time itself.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think another important part of this is that, there's launch time of your code that you wrote yourself, mostly in the launch with options delegate method. But before that, there's like a launch time related to all the libraries that are loaded, kind of like a linking phase. It might be less obvious to monitor that part. I think what we do at Bitrise, we look at the Xcode statistics for launch time. Those are super easy to look at. I think they include from iOS 12 and up, but at least iOS 13 and up in retrospect. So you kind of have a lot of data already at your disposal. And there's like a differentiator between like an average, like what is for most users the launch time, and there's like a percentile of launch time for like 90%. I think it's the other metric, but it at least gives you an indication. And once we know like, hey, launch time suddenly went really high up, then it's a moment for us to start debugging. And for that, there are several techniques to really get that information, like what Bruno mentioned as well. But you also have like launch arguments that print out like the linking phases, and more specifically, which libraries took the longest. So for example, if you have a custom library Alarmifier and that's loading really slow, and this one isn't probably, but it could be, then you'll see that, and you can ask yourself the question, do I really need Alarmifier, or do I want to use the URL session implementation and rewrite it? And that saves me 100 milliseconds in launch time, for example. And once you do that, you can basically start monitoring what Xcode brings you again and see whether your fix kind of worked.
Okay. And in terms of these kind of types of metrics as well, so crashes, they come through, you get notified that there's a crash if it's something new, and maybe you check on them, on a daily basis. How often do you keep an eye on these types of performance metrics?
Yeah, that's something we can improve on. I guess with tools like Firebase, you can automate monitoring crashes going up rapidly. Like crashes that suddenly affect a lot of users. I think Firebase even has a tool for that as well, performance monitoring for the same matter. In my example, launch time monitoring in Xcode, so far there's no way to monitor that automatically. So it kind of comes down to once a month we revisit those metrics ourselves, and we kind of look at it, which is not the best answer to this. So hopefully any of the others have a better answer to this.
I have something to add here. I think there's an interesting gap between you as a developer or as a person receiving those emails about new crashes, getting that email or that velocity notification, and between that other point where that is a task that can be worked on and can be prioritized and can be reasoned about with product managers or with person prioritizing your tasks. I think there's a gap there because often you can get a lot of crashes or some crashes that are one-off, or crashes coming from Apple's own frameworks, and the more users you have, the more of these things you will get that you cannot really fix, or you have to find out that you cannot fix them, right? So there's this gap where I think it needs like a human person who goes through these crashes and actually looks at them, at those stack traces, right? And figures out, okay, what part of the app does it affect? And maybe if you have multiple teams working on the app, like in a bigger company, which team would be responsible for handling that crash? Like whose backlog should it land on, right? Or even if you have just one team, investigating a little bit and seeing whether, whether that affects a sign up or, settings, right? And then you explain to your product manager, hey, we have a crash that happens in these cases and affects that many and that many users in these parts of the flow of their user journey. And that can be, solved differently. You could have automated tools that, repost everything, like all incoming crashes automatically to your bug tracking system like Jira or something else. Or you could have a more manual process where you manually create tasks in the corresponding projects. So there's a lot of variety there, I think, in different companies, depending on the team size and how big, how big and corporate you are as well.
There's been a couple of mentions of Xcode metrics and things. What are our thoughts on these performance monitoring capabilities that are coming out of Apple with MetricKit and their performance APIs and things like that? Do we have any opinions on those?
Yeah, so I did look into it. Once it was announced, I was super happy because I was like, whoa, okay, this opens up doors, So I kind of like, at that moment, I kind of asked myself the question whether I should blog about it or not. I ended up not doing it. And the reason for it is that it's a great API, let me mention that as first, but you need your self-hosted web service for it. So what you can do is you can kind of like use MetricKit to create your own kind of logging mechanisms. For example, like in our case, we could create like an upload started and an upload ended, and that would be one metric. And that's kind of like the upload success rate metric. And you can post all kinds of data with it to your self-hosted web service. So the downside of it obviously is that you need to create that web service that communicates with MetricKit. The upside is that Apple kind of like gives you a whole mechanism that every now and then, I think it's once per 24 hours, sends that data from the users that accepted doing that monitoring to your service. So you don't have to think about when to send it or how to send it, or it will be done at a time that the system is kind of like sleeping in a way, it's either on a battery charger or those kind of like moments where it makes sense to send over the data. The short answer, I didn't look into MetricKit more enough yet.
You raised some good points there. Like they do have the advantage of having those more lower level access to the platform, so they can make better use of how they collect the data and when they transmit it and things like that. So those are some interesting things that we've seen. Yeah.
One thing you could do is, by the way, create unit tests, or I think even UI tests, but more certain unit tests where you can use the new metrics to, for example, see how a certain flow is doing in terms of memory. So you have the memory metric, or you have the CPU metric. Those kind of like unit tests can be like a bandwidth test to see whether your code is still performing like you expected. That could be super interesting to look into, because you don't need such web service or something, and you can basically just run the test on your CI system like you would do with other unit tests on pull requests, for example.
Remember, there's even some utilities for it. Like there's a unit test example for them where you can use MetricKit to get the launch time of the app. It's like something automatic that the API itself already has.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good example, indeed.
Yeah, I never really got to use MetricKit as well, but it sounds like, if I'm right by your description, it sounds more like they give you the front end and the system itself inside the phone, and you just have to build the system that actually receives these events, right?
Yeah, when I was watching that session at WWDC, at first I was like, whoa, can we create our own metrics that show up in the Xcode organizer? I was blown away. I was like, that made total sense in a way. Or maybe an App Store Connect or such kind of like environment. But yeah, then I was quite soon disappointed that you need to create that yourself. So that would be a great level up this WWDC if they deliver that to us as well.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where they're going with that, whether they plan on adding those extra visualizations in App Store Connect, or whether it's just going to be APIs that can integrate with our monitoring solutions and things. Awesome. Okay. I have an interesting question here, which is a big philosophical question. How do you think mobile observability has changed in recent years? and where do you see the next big breakthrough in this area?
I'm losing you, Colin.
Can you hear me?
Oh, that's fine. I think
Yeah,
it's maybe
it's
on
fine.
your side.
It's me.
Oh, okay.
I think.
I have
Bad
occasional
internet.
internet issues. Yeah, let me say that again. So the big introduction, and then anyway, how do you think mobile observability or monitoring has changed in recent years, and what do you see as the next big breakthroughs in that area? Bruno, do you have some opinions on this one?
Yeah, I was thinking here because I remember when we first talked about this, I actually had a good answer, and I forgot what it was. So I'll come up with something completely new. But what I think is, from the last years to now, I think the scale of iOS apps and other apps in general grew up a lot. The size of companies in general became massive, and now we have all of these concepts of super massive apps that do a lot of stuff. So I would say that most of monitoring nowadays is pretty new, because in the past we didn't really need those things. Like, why would you want to evaluate the performance time for a specific task if you have a very simple app with very simple users? But now the apps are pretty much computers on their own. Like Spotify has 3 billion features and so on, and you can do a lot of stuff at the same time. So the sort of stuff became more critical. What will be the next breakthrough? I was hoping that I was going to remember what I would answer last time, but I still don't remember it. And I'm going to think about it. What do the others think about this?
Seems you someone mentioning that one of the biggest changes that we went through was Google acquiring Crashlytics.
Yeah,
Ouch.
that was I would call that the biggest thing that has happened in the last 10 years of analytics. Google just buying everything, Firebase, Crashlytics, just just trying to own everything and all our data as well.
Yeah,
I remember now. I remember what I was going to say. Sorry, Antoine.
Go ahead.
I was going to
Bring
say
it
in the case of next breakthrough, I think it would be pretty cool if Apple itself created a service, a decent service for crash reporting and logging and all of that. Even though we do have one today, it's still pretty bare bones, and I don't think we can rely on it as a big company, for example.
Yeah. And I think super hot lately, also related to Google in a way again. But we're struggling at WeTransfer quite a bit now with GDPR and the whole privacy pop-ups you need to show to all the users. If in any way you're collecting data, including crash reports, logging, all those kinds of stuff. So it's becoming harder to monitor everything you want to monitor before, where before you might easily jump on Firebase, use it with their breadcrumb feature, which makes it easier to solve crashes. But now suddenly you need to think about like, hey, do I want to even think about using third-party tools, or maybe create something self-hosted so I can maybe get rid of that pop-up in a way, you know? That's kind of the transition I feel like we're in right now today. Yeah,
data privacy is a very interesting topic.
Yeah. I can add a little bit to that as well.
Sure.
I totally agree with the guys about privacy being a big trend right now. And I think what we're missing on the mobile analytics side, not just iOS, but I think Android as well, is privacy first solutions. So that, whether that's Apple who comes up with a really usable and scalable thing, or a third party company, I think we need that, and I think it should come sooner rather than later. So an analytic service that lets you not only like monitor crashes and the performance, but also analytic events. So that's something that a lot of companies rely on heavily, knowing which features are used or not used. And Anton mentioned that in the beginning as well. And right now there's a big trend on the web. There's a lot of services that appeared in the last few years. Some are like Plausible, Matomo. I personally use a small service called the Goat Counter on my website. So what they do and how they're different from Google Analytics and like Mixpanel is that they do not have a concept of tracking a user, like an individual user. They use some fingerprinting that is very localized in time, so they can distinguish if it's the same user within, different 5 minutes visiting your website, but they cannot tell that it's the same user if it's been an hour or a day since, even for the same website. And of course, not even talking about cross-tracking people. And we don't have that for mobile. Like all the services that exist, they all either use a vendor identifier to uniquely identify the device, or they use some sort of their own UID, and you can try to opt out of every single way they try to track you. But it's really hard, like Antoine said, it's hard to opt out of everything because they make it hard.
Yeah, well, I think in that list of Plausible and those kind of toolings, if I recall correctly, last week, I think it's app telemetry.
Right. It just launched last week. Yeah,
exactly. And that well, they say are an answer to that for mobile apps, but I'm not sure if that also allows you to get rid of that app tracking transparency pop-up, which was introduced in iOS 14.5. I feel like you need to show it no matter what, unless you're not monitoring anything. But yeah, there is kind of an answer to that right now. I think at least something similar to Plausible and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really hoping that this service takes off, and yeah, more people use it.
Awesome. As a quick kind of a little bit of a backstep there, we talked about services being acquired. Obviously, Google having a large presence in terms of the platforms being provided, Microsoft acquiring organizations and setting up platforms, and obviously Apple there. We don't have much coming out of Amazon, and this is my tenuous link into an attendee question is, what are our thoughts on AWS CloudWatch logs? And yeah, what are our thoughts on that? Have we tried using it? To me, it sounds more like that. It's one that I have used before for server monitoring, but not for mobile app monitoring. But I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that one.
It feels a bit like a backend kind of question, less mobile in a way. But I'm a bit shaming now because we transfer heavily builds on top of Amazon. All the transfers are sent to AWS. But I have no idea whether or not we're using CloudWatch logs. We're using AppSignal and those kind of monitoring systems for our backend APIs, so we can see which endpoints perform worse or have failures quite often. But I'm not sure about AWS, what we're using there.
Do you know what this is, CloudWatch logs? Because I don't actually know what this is. Is this for the? Sorry, do you know what it is?
Well, I haven't heard about it before.
Is it like Cloudflare logging, or?
It's a centralized logging platform, so you can send your logs there and then have a point to query them from.
This is the worst answer we can give as a panel,
Oh no, we'll go. Okay, on that note, let's move on to the next area. So in terms of we talked about the tools that are provided by the individual platforms, but obviously there are some third-party solutions available as well. What would you see as the benefits for using a third-party monitoring solution? Bruno, do you have any thoughts on that one?
I think it depends on exactly what you want to monitor. Something that I was going to add to the previous question is that for logging, for example, if you want to do application logging, like normal events, information that you want to store, for like warnings and errors, so on, I actually think that it's pretty good to do those things like yourself, to have your own system. So something that I always like to do is that if you do login, I would actually store a file in the user's device with what it was printing. So in the event of a crash, we actually give the instructions for the user to get this file and send it to us, and we know exactly what happened. And if the user is running a debug build for an employee version, then what is debug? Is actually, we debug a lot more stuff than we usually. But for the production release, we will only debug like actual errors and stuff, just to, both for privacy reasons and not to dump the entire HD of the user with debugging crap. But yeah,
Well, you had a good
Yeah,
point earlier, right, Bruno, about the crashes and being combined in Firebase and you know, the breadcrumbs and so on.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that is interesting as well, because you have both logging in the sense of having your own system that you can extract, but also a platform that can handle that, especially if it's Firebase. I think it's good to have both. I don't know the impact of you logging everything to Firebase, though. I don't know if it has an impact in, let's say that it just takes too much energy to keep sending this to Firebase all the time, or maybe it sends at once. I think it depends on how good the tooling is implemented, I would guess.
Well, I have a fun story about a colleague who did a big query, a big query that cost us a lot of money. So if you send a lot of events, then it can definitely add up money. Yeah, you have to be careful sometimes.
And I think also what you say, Bruno, about it being tricky and hopefully that they implement it well. I think that's another benefit of using a third-party service, is that implementing your own tracking solution and respecting devices, energy situation, and if the battery's low, and batching things because you want to make requests small enough that they actually go through on slow networks and stuff like. It's actually tricky and a lot of work to get right, and a lot of testing to get right. So if you don't have those resources, then you resort to using third-party solutions.
Yeah, and I think there are two other options you have. One is obviously the tools that Apple provides, which are built into Xcode. You kind of get them for free, and most simple apps kind of are fine using them, and it saves you from including a framework like Firebase, which adds a lot of other dependencies as well, and that can add up to your launch time. And each dependency is one dependency that you need to keep up to date. And developers at Google are also developers that make mistakes. It could be that they bring bugs as well. Another option would be a third-party tool, but then self-hosted in a way, next to 2.5 party maybe. I don't know. Either way, yeah, we use Snowplow, for example. We're kind of migrating to it right now, where we have a self-hosted event solution. And in terms of the GDPR, and I don't want to dive in too much into GDPR because I'm far away from an expert, but I think that opens up possibilities, at least when you're not using a third party and you're not delivering your data to a different company than yourself. So yeah, that's another option you have.
If this is also where MetricKit kind of falls, right? Because you have the system and you host it yourself.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. It's funny, we should build a metric hosting company, a MetricKit hosting service.
I was thinking about that. I have it written down.
Oh,
it's like ideas for later.
we are giving it away now to the 75 attendees. But I want it, I'll buy it.
On a kind of related note, one of the questions that we've had is around what have you found to be the most challenging metric that you've been looking to monitor, and why has that been a challenge from a performance monitoring perspective? Marina,
say something maybe.
Sorry, carry on, Bruno.
No, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
You can go first.
Sure. I think the hardest thing to track about how apps are doing out there in the wild is things that you cannot track with tools. So actually things like, are people struggling with using your app? Is there any functional areas that prevent the users from from using your app effectively, or reaching and doing things that you want them to do? And that could be both, technical issues, like, login button doesn't work, and how soon do you find out about it? Like, how does the customer support reported 3 days later that, hey, we got like a few reports of the same thing, then there's probably an issue. Or how do you find out about these things? So I think that's the hardest part, because a crash, you get an email if crashes happen, or, the logs you can see and so on. But the human part, the more subtle things are the trickiest, I think. maybe that's not exactly the answer you were looking for, but
I think it's a good one. I think it touches on a very kind of, I think, unique aspect to monitoring from the client perspective, is that there is that heavy overlap between analytics and what's happening from the user's perspective, what constitutes a bug and how important it is. I think that's one of a very interesting point you touched on there, that it's that overlap and understanding how they relate and correlating the data between those. Because if you have found an issue, understanding, okay, what did the user do to get there and what happened as part of that build up.
Yeah, and that as well. Yeah, and especially if you have really good error handling in the app and you have 100% crash-free rates, so your app doesn't crash when issues happen, it just gracefully handles them. How do you then find out about them, right? So that's also a tricky part there. Or it could be just a small, guard, something else, just return, a path that is so rare that you didn't even think to like propagate an error message to the user. Those can be really tricky to find out about.
This is an interesting subject, right? There are developers that purposely use force wrapping and rather see the app crash and know about it than using optionals everywhere and just return silently. I think you make a very good point that 100% crash-free app doesn't mean your app is functional. You also have to note for yourself that every now and then you look at those non-fatal errors that you can also log in many tools and see how they perform, because maybe sometimes those are even worse,
Yeah, totally. Like the app crashing for 50% of users or being just a blank white screen for 100%, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Or when you deadlock the app and then you have no information at all. If you mess up your threads and then you just have nothing, the app just freezes and there's no logging or anything. What I was going to answer to this question is actually kind of the same thing, but from a different perspective, and is the perspective of the programmer itself. Something that I think that is difficult to track are certain pieces of metadata from the app itself. For example, how many assets are you packing inside your application and how big is just the binary in general? And the reason this is difficult is that even though you can track this, it's probably expensive for you to track this every time. I built an operation to check this sort of information, like size of the app, like how many tests you have. Maybe you just want to track the metadata of your team. If you have any tests, how many features do you have? How many targets do you have in Xcode? This sort of stuff. And the problem is that it is difficult to calculate this information. So even though you probably would like to know how much every pull request is affecting the size of your application, it's probably kind of expensive to do this because you actually have to build the application, have to gather everything and so on. So it becomes kind of expensive. So what we used to do at a previous company is that we did this, but we did this for every release. So every time you did a release, you would run this tool, and the tool would like vomit a bunch of information in the Slack channel, say, hey, this is now the size of the app. This is how many tests you have. This is how many features you have. And this is how it variated between the latest version. But I would really like to have this in a more instant manner, even if you could do this inside Xcode itself. I just added so much of code. I added an asset. This is how much it's going to add for the final binary. I think this would be perfect, but it's very difficult to calculate this information.
Maybe when we have like M5, oh, sorry, when we have like M5 super fast, so you can do it on every build.
Yeah, I think I need to get back to you, Bruno, because recently I was looking into this and I found some kind of like tool that looks into the archive you created. And from within that archive, there's a specific file which you can read in. It's a package, you open up the package, and then in there, there's information about the outcome app size. It might not be good enough because it's kind of like the answer to what is your whole app changing in terms of size, so not specific to one asset and how big is that asset going to be, but you could at least use that for pull requests to more easily differentiate between what is the development size currently and calculate the difference in a way. But I have to look more into what this was again, but there is
no, you're right. That's exactly what we do, actually. The problem is exactly that you have to archive the app to do this. And if you have a
Okay.
clean CI and you're trying to do everything cleanly and you don't have like remote cache setup, then that could take a while. That's the problem.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah, and especially if the size of the app is, like Spotify, for example, or even a few times. Yeah, still quite big.
Yeah, I think someone in the chat mentions Swift Info. That's a great tool. I think it
That's the
works with
tool I need.
Danger as well. Yeah, that can provide that information in a way.
What do you do with that information? So do you have a threshold in terms of the size that you're kind of prepared to accept for the application? And then what do you do off the back of that? Try and optimize or increase the threshold?
Yeah, so what this tool does specifically is that it builds graphs for that. So it can actually analyze how much the app is growing or not. But basically the intention would be for that you run this and you see, okay, there's an increase, massive increase in the size of the app that shouldn't be happening in this pull request that I made. So you'd be careful of that and you would immediately patch that. It's basically to eliminate surprises when you actually launch your app, the version of your app, basically.
And in terms of obviously releasing new versions of the application, we talked about tracking app size and things. Are there any other metrics that you keep a special eye on as part of releasing a new version?
I guess we covered quite a bit already. I guess I can tell the story about an app release that we do at WeTransfer. We do a phased release by default, so that at least gives us the opportunity to gracefully see how a build is performing, and it also allows us to quickly cancel a release or work on a hotfix, and catch a crash early on before it reaches the whole user base in a way. But I guess a lot of monitoring happens before even releasing, like we just discussed. So app size is just a metric, but you can validate code coverage for a certain feature as well, and all those kind of monitoring events in a pull request, and not even merge in code if it doesn't match your level of expectations in terms of code quality.
Are there any particular metrics you track as part of that release process, so post-build, but before you release to the stores of testing phases?
I feel like Bruno has a great answer to this. I feel like Spotify has a lot of metrics like this. At WeTransfer, at least, we mostly want to see CI being green, and that comes down to the tests succeeding. And we kind of test all the packages that are affected by the code change. So we don't test all the things, and even the things that aren't changed, so to lower the amount of time spent on testing. And then there is like a daily test run that does everything just to make sure that we're all green. But yeah, like I said, I'm curious to see what Spotify is monitoring in this sense, like app size and those kind of things.
I actually missed part of the question. What was the main question that sparked this calling?
So we talked about kind of as part of the build process, but then after that, between you producing the build and actually releasing to the App Store, are there any particular metrics that you keep an eye on as part of the testing process, or maybe as a part of initial rollout that you keep a special eye on from a performance monitoring perspective?
Yeah, so I don't think we do. Part of them are automatic and part of them are not, because I think there are two things that we're talking about here. We have the monitoring on the crash itself, which is that like we have the process that we take to launch an update of the app, and then we take a look inside our beta versions of Spotify to see if there's something wrong with the crash numbers, if they're not expected, or if there are crashes that we already know, or if there are new things. This is something that we check for every release. And then we have the tracking for the performance itself. This is not something that is specific for a release, but something that is handled for a specific performance squad that we have. So that we have people that they build those metrics and they check them every time. So regardless of if this is a new version or it's just a pull request that we added, we're going to have those dashboards that we can see this information. So yes, but they are treated in different moments.
Is there anything unique to streaming type applications that you require special types of monitoring?
I wouldn't say so, actually. Or if there is, then I'm not aware of it. Because I might not have explored that part of the app so much.
Okay.
I can answer to that because I worked for 4 years at an audiobook company.
Right.
I wouldn't say there's anything specific in terms of metrics, but there's one thing that it's really hard to test. And there's a lot of potential things that could go wrong when you are streaming, in terms of not just the technical part of streaming itself, but the user navigating the file, especially if you talk about books, and synchronizing, bookmarks where you are in the book between different devices and so on. It's very tricky scenario. So if you do any changes there, it's really tricky to test and tricky to automate testing of that in a more like real life fashion. Of course, unit tests are something that you do, but more integration testing is quite tricky and often requires manual testing. So quite a lot of it. So it's a tricky part there. But I can also add to release monitoring that one thing that helps is limiting size of each release. So the less changes that go into the release, the less scary it is to release it. So that's something to keep in mind. And when doing regular releases, especially to like also find balance between not releasing too often as well, but also keeping the changes small. So
Right.
that helps. Yeah, because then if the release is crashing, you can go through that, pull request merging the release branch and try to find what changed in a more manageable fashion.
Yeah, and in terms of video monitoring, 4 years ago when I joined WeTransfer, I left the company heavily focused on video streaming, and I created the Dutch Netflix called Videoland. And what we did there, we built in like tracking tools in a way that it was like every minute there would be an event that a certain duration of the video was reached, and that way you can find like the success rate of a video being played. And you can also track like whether or not that user liked the video, because if it reached like 95% of the video, you're pretty sure that the video was completely watched. So you can kind of add that to its likings, and that way you can find out more about the user in a way. And I guess that could also be seen as a monitoring way where, as long as you get those events in a way, it's still working. But it often comes with built-in players and those companies like Brightcove, and I think Fairplay has its from Apple has its own mechanisms as well to monitor how video streams are performing in a way.
We've got a question here. Which tools do you use to track down app crashes other than Google Firebase? A shameless plug, we have a tool at Bitrise called Trace, which captures crash reports as well if you're looking for alternatives to Firebase. But a good one for the panel, we've mentioned a few, but is it mostly Firebase that you're all using, or are there any other interesting ones that you also use?
Yeah, so I think we mentioned it a few times already, but Xcode comes with one as well. And kind of a benefit of it is that you can jump into the code directly. So it shows you kind of the backtrace from the part of the code where it crashed, which can be super nice. And you can also see on which system versions it occurred. You can mark it as being fixed. I'm not sure if you get a notification as well when the crash returns in a future version, but yeah, like I said before, I think for many apps that could be good enough to begin with. But it's good to mention that it's opt-in for iOS users, so you won't get all the crashes from all the users.
Yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't have a lot to add here. Unfortunately, I've used Mixpanel before and Facebook Analytics as well, and they both have crash monitoring, but it was very, at the time I used it, it was very simple. So you get like a crash, like a text that you get with a crash, which you don't even always get. So you don't get even a stack trace at the time that I used it. You basically get a very short information about that a crash happened. So Crashlytics was much more advanced already at the time. And then since then, it's just Crashlytics and now Firebase, which is a bit unfortunate, I think. So
I do have another tool. It's not really crash reporting in a way, but we created our own tooling. It's called Diagnostics. It's a framework you can just add, and it allows users to send a diagnostics report from the app to the support team. And it comes with logs, user defaults, or your custom reports. But it also includes like an exception, like a crash, if it managed to catch it in a way. And the great thing about that is that it's just a Swift package. You can include it in your app, and you get like a whole log with all your custom logs that you would have with your normal debug session as well. So you kind of have the breadcrumb as detailed as your logging is, followed by the crash and information about that crash, which can be a super nice solution as well. I think apps like 1Password build something similar as well, which you can check out if you like.
There's a question here specifically for you, Bruno. You mentioned having a special dashboard for metrics. Is there a particular tool you use for building those dashboards?
Let me see. I was trying to find a question. You mentioned metrics special dashboards. Which service do you use to build? Okay, so in the case of Spotify, the answer is almost always going to be that we have our own thing. We just do it. But I would say that if you want to do something like this, I have seen that one thing that works very well, in my opinion, that I've seen done before, and that a lot of big companies do, is that if you have the ability of sending some information to the backend from our app, or maybe you can just extract it down somehow, what you can actually do is that you can fill this to a database somewhere in Google BigQuery, for example, and then you can generate a Tableau dashboard from it. And from there, you can build really good dashboards for this kind of stuff. So kind of all you have to do is have some backend integration where you can send this somewhere. But if you don't, then, I mean, you could do this manually, but if you have a backend to support this, then it actually is something that works. But we kind of have our own thing to send this information somewhere. But Tableau is my suggestion, basically.
Yes, a very powerful tool, Tableau. And we kind of touched on this a little bit, that we have a question around what app monitoring tools do you use when system requirements are, you have high security requirements and anonymity, I believe there. I think that we touched on, we mentioned a couple of tools around heavy data privacy tools and kind of self-hosting tools and things like that. I don't know if we have anything else to add to those, really.
Yeah, I feel like you would have to go with a self-hosted tool or a like fully self-written analytics if you need high security.
Or like a gateway or so, like a facade where, and then from your backend you send it to other services.
And then there's another question here. What tools would you suggest for monitoring and for builds and for iOS for junior or new developers? What kind of tooling would you recommend for builds? Obviously, shameless plug, I'd recommend you start off with Bitrise. You can sign up for free and get going. But again, handing that over to the panel, anything you'd recommend for new developers to get started in this area of build automation?
I think there's one obvious answer, right? Like there was a big framework of being open sourced or open source for a while, which is super famous, and Bitrise is using it heavily as well, which is Fastlane. I would definitely start there. I guess there are a lot of community related articles explaining to you how it works. But yeah, in all honesty, we're using Bitrise at WeTransfer and it's super easy to set up. So I could definitely argue that that's a really good recommendation if you want to stay like, well, not go that deep and keep it simple. But yeah, Fastlane in general, it is a learning curve, but it's definitely doable.
Yeah, I can also recommend if starting with SwiftLint, if you just want to go into the whole build tools area and just try something out, because it's a very low impact. It doesn't affect anything that you actually deliver. It's more on analyzing your PRs or analyzing your code. So it's a low impact tool that you can start with, and maybe set it up on CI or set it up locally first. And then make it if you use GitHub, make it so it runs on every pull request or on every commit, and then go from there, because that process then you can use for then you can have Fastlane run on pull requests and so on as well. But just to try it.
It's a very good tip you gave there. Like try it out locally. I've been there, changing something, letting CI run, wait 20 minutes, see that it doesn't work, run again. If you can manage to run it locally, and all the kind of tools, just like Bitrise provides you ways to run stuff locally. Danger, for example, provides ways as well. It's much faster. It doesn't require checking out your project and setting up all the toolings. So yeah, to iterate fast and learn fast, I would definitely recommend running things locally first. Yeah.
Yeah,
I can recommend Danger as well.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. When I heard SwiftLint, I remember that Danger is probably one of my favorite tools for this kind of stuff in previous projects. Because if you don't know, Danger is a static analysis tool for pull requests. And you can have it run things like SwiftLint, but you can also kind of create your own kind of stuff. So we would use this to code all sorts of rules for random things, not just code related, but also repo related. Like, should I need a code owner for this? Like, should I put a warning because you modified a specific file that I think you shouldn't have modified in the scenario? You have access to all the diff of the pull request inside the tool, and you can use this to build any kinds of warnings or run any sorts of things. I think it's super cool as a way to mix all of these tools together.
Or say hi Bruno when the username is Bruno.
Yeah, and I never made a pull request before. Those are the most
exactly. Yeah, that's a very very good one.
Excellent. Well, yeah, we've kind of lost track of time there. It's been a good conversation. Yeah, I think we'll kind of wrap things up there. Appreciate all of you joining the panel today. It's been great to hear your kind of insights from the world of app development and the approaches you take to the panel. Any further kind of closing thoughts that you have on any of this that you'd like to wrap up with before we close?
I think it was super interesting. I was honestly interested to hear the other panelists share their stories as well. It's inspiring. And yeah, maybe there's a new tool coming up with MetricKit. Who knows?
You never know.
Watch this space.
I want to see your list now, Marina.
Yeah, it has a couple of recommendations from you guys as well, like really cool. Everyone sharing their favorite tools and open source things. Yeah, so that's awesome.
I think it's awesome as well to get a perspective of different companies of different sizes doing the same problem. You can learn a lot just from sheer differences between the companies.
Great. No, again, thank you for joining. Thank you for everyone attending. This has been great, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.